Thank you so much, and it's a great pleasure. And I really want to thank also Beatrice and Deborah from GISIS to put this conference together. I think it's so important for us to take the time to discuss the results that we get from these kinds of surveys in depth. Often, we have a report, we take the results for granted, we put this into the policy debate, but what is really important, you could see that during these 2 days, when there's so many issues that we should really discuss, and also then see how can they flow into the future of those kinds of surveys. My second request to you is to come into the front, and you will see at the latest when you see the font size of my screens why this is really advisable. But I would really suggest, there's a lot of space here, and I think the charts are really important. And, I'm going to devote my presentation to one of those, dilemmas that I really leave us with a lot of puzzles, and that's the relationship between skills and qualifications. And PIAAC raises a lot of questions of, what are we doing in school and university? How does what we value in school relate to the skills that we actually observe when we look at what people know and can do? And you can see that almost, when you open the first page of PIAAC and you look at, how countries come up, and you can see that very large share of people with very low skills. For me, this was the biggest surprise in the whole survey. When you look at level 1 in PIAAC, that's what you expect from a 10-year-old child in reading. You look at, reading curricula, we ask actually more from a 10-year-old child than what we see in very large shares of populations. And most of the people that you see on the chart have actually gone to school. They've been in school for 10 years, for sometimes 12 years. I mean, that is the first big puzzle that we need to answer. Are people falling through the cracks in our education systems? Are we not picking up the right skills when we measure them directly in PIAAC? Of course, we do also have, a lot of people then who make it beyond that threshold. That's the good thing. But, that very large share of people who, live in our societies who do not have the means to access even basic service. I mean, these days you can't even buy a bus ticket without level 1 on the PIAAC kind of assessment. And, then people debate, should we look at numeracy separately? But actually, when you see how countries come up on both aspects, a little bit of a variability. You can see a country like the United States doing a little bit better on literacy than in numeracy. The Singaporeans is the other way around. It's not actually a lot of difference. The story remains the same. A second part, that strikes you when you look at the results is that fairly large impact of social background on the success of people. We all strive for education systems where the most talented and most motivated get the best opportunities. And the reality is very different from that, at least when it comes to the outcomes of those efforts. But what is also interesting, and this is where the comparisons is so interesting, you look at this across countries, you can see in a country like Germany here, that difference is very large. You come from a less educated family, you do really bad. You come from a well-educated family, you do as well as people in most systems. If you go to Spain, average performance is not so different, but the gap is much smaller. And it shows us, again, is this a measurement effect, or is that something that our societies do differently in providing people with different kind of skills, opportunities? No clear answers. We have just cross-sectional data, but I do think these are very, very important questions. And then, of course, how things have changed. Now, that is where, to me, the surprises are biggest. You look at traditional statistics of education, more and more people get better and better qualifications. Now, you look at university completion across the OECD countries, it's an amazing picture, doubling over the last, 20 years. You look at, high school completion, increasing in almost every country of the OECD. Then you look at the PIAAC skills and you get suddenly a very different picture. Now, what is this telling us? Are we seeing a kind of inflation of the labor market value of degrees and qualifications? Are we not picking up the right skills? I think those are questions that we need to ask ourselves. So let's have a look at, some of those data. The first thing I already mentioned, you look at the share of young adults with a master's degree, and it just between, last 5 years, 2019 and 2024, and you can see, how things have changed. These are, in a historic sense, dramatic rises in education attainment in relatively short periods. Lots more people get better qualifications. We don't know where this is going to end up with, but it's very, very increasing. But then, you square that with actual skill levels, and you can see that we have actually seen a deterioration, certainly among those without baseline qualifications. Has it become easier to get a baseline qualification than in the past for less skill levels? No. That would be a worrying signal that we depreciate the value of a high school qualification and below. No. What is behind those kinds of figures? No? Suddenly, or has the context of literacy changed? No? That's also a really important question that we need to ask ourselves. No? Are we using our literacy skills today in different ways than we did in the past? No? And that question becomes even more relevant when you look at this in a more, shorter period of time over the last, decade since the first PIAAC assessment. You can see a couple of countries, Finland and Denmark, where you can say, yeah, skill levels keep rising among adults. And I know our last session in this room was about linking the PISA and the PIAAC story, and this is actually one of the puzzles. These both belong to countries where we have seen the biggest drop in skills in the PISA assessments. Among the 15-year-olds, Finland is probably the saddest story. They used to be #1 when PISA was created, and they have since seen a steep decline. But then you look at the results from the survey of adult skills, and they are among 2 lucky ones who have seen increases. Most countries are on the right side, and actually if you add those where we have done the survey on a slightly different timeline, most of them go into the negatives. Now, I think that is a really troubling picture. Everybody today talks about, upskilling and reskilling and rising skill demands of labor markets and, AI requiring from you that you can distinguish fact from opinion and all of that, and then we see that where things go in the opposite direction. We actually see fewer skills. No easy answers for this. And the biggest puzzle if we would see the same picture in numeracy and problem solving, we could say, okay, people become more stupid. I mean, that's something that you can sort of plausibly engage with. But, we see that picture in literacy. We don't see that picture in numeracy. Things in numeracy have been a lot more stable. And perhaps technology has something to do with this. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you all probably read more complex documents. You read books where you had to engage with, build a mental representation of complex realities, engage with characters and heroes who have different views and perspectives. You had to reconcile them. And today, you listen to that marmalade that comes out of ChatGPT and just gives you simple snippets of, prefabricated answers. So, probably, this has something to do with this. But if that's the reality, how do you square that with rising qualifications? I think these are a real difficult question. And, people see that at the first time, and the answer was, oh, yeah, we got more immigrants or more disadvantaged in our population. But, you discount for that. You explain a little bit, but not very much. Actually, you see a few more countries, you can say now also Sweden and Norway are among the countries that actually have seen rises. They have just been depreciated by, more disadvantaged population groups. But in Korea, you can say also they would do a little bit better. But for most countries, it doesn't make much of a difference. It's not that the population has changed. It's actually, even in similar population compositions, you'd seen that kind of same picture. And I think that's something that we need to look at. And when you look at this in more detail, you actually see that where that drop in literacy comes from is mostly the share of people with very low qualifications. And again, has this to do with it's become easier to get certain qualifications, or, literacy skills have depreciated. I think we need good answers to this question when we design and redesign education systems now. Social background, that's, a set part, again, of the whole story, is that the social gap in literacy proficiency has clearly widened, particularly in countries like Estonia, Austria, Germany. And, when you talk about 20, 25 score points, that's really a lot, That translates into sort of years of learning gains. And we can see basically that's something that is, and this is just a change in the gap in literacy proficiency with, people from well-educated and poorly educated parents. So I think that's a big issue to, in societies which all pride themselves to be meritocratic. And again, you discount for all sorts of background factors, and you end up with, sometimes, a reduced problem, but certainly not, getting to the zero line. In most countries, you remain in that kind of negative kind of relationship. I already mentioned, you can't see that in numeracy. That's an encouraging part, that, there are things that we are still as good as we were 10 years ago. You would want to be better, but I mean, at least it is a quite of, processing kind of skills related that are most affected now. Now that's the short-term picture, what's happened in the last decade. You can look at this across cohorts with PIAAC, and that's perhaps in many ways a more interesting picture when you look at this across longer periods, generations. And you can see when you look in the young population, this is how the world looks. These are the 16 to 24-year-olds on the assessment. This is the older generation, the 55 to 64-year-olds. And you can see, really, really interesting, how that, intergenerational gap varies dramatically. You take a country, like the United States, and you can see the older generation does better than the older generation in many other countries. Older Americans actually have a quite good level of literacy skills compared with most other countries. But then you look at the younger cohort, and you can see suddenly the United States has dropped dramatically below the OECD average. And this is about literacy, which is actually what they are best in. You look at Singapore as another example, and there you can see the older generation did really poorly, and the young generation does really well. And that also explains why, Singapore doesn't come out particularly well in the overall PIAAC assessment. Now, when you look at assessment of young people, school-based assessment, Singapore is always at the top of the league tables. Now, in the whole population, it is not, because it hasn't done particularly well with older generations. Now, upskilling and reskilling, we haven't seen that much growth on that part of the distribution. By the way, in many countries as well. But what you can see is simply the inter-cohort growth rates have been varied hugely across countries. If you look at the last country on our list, that is Chile. Also, that is a country that has actually been progressing very, very fast. Now, the younger generation is still the last, but has, you can see, actually very, very significant growth. And then, if you do rankings about it, you can see how Singapore has moved from rank 25 to rank 5, Estonia from 29 to 15, Korea from 16th to 4th. Some countries have really moved a lot across cohorts. And then, on the other hand, you can see New Zealand dropping from 5th to 22nd, Slovak Republic from 6th to 19th, and United States from 10th to the 20th. So there's been actually a lot of changes. It shows you that success is never forever. You can have a very well-educated population and live on that for some time. The good thing is that your economy is still built largely on, those older cohorts, but that only lasts for some time. The future is in the blue triangle, and countries that are falling back on that will have, big issues. Last point on this is, and that's, perhaps not such a good news, is that we see very little movement afterwards. Now, when you look at, 16 to 24 and then 25 to 34-year-olds. You know, a few countries, you can look at Finland, Estonia, parts of Belgium, Sweden, Denmark, but apart from that, the blue dot is pretty much where the blue triangle was, and that really shows us that, you know, learning sort of stops. Our systems are still very much geared towards getting you up to a certain level of skills, but then, you know, this idea of lifelong, life-wide learning is very, very distant in kind of the realities that we have today, and I think that's a real kind of problem. But, you know, I said at the beginning, I wanted to drill a little bit into this, you know, paradox with education. What you see very clearly on that is that, you know, college graduates usually have better skills than people with, you know, high school degrees and below. Now, that's not a surprise on average, no? But there's a lot of overlap, both within countries and across countries. No? You take a Finnish high school graduate, no? And that high school graduate has better literacy skills than a college graduate in most other countries. So once again, you know, what is the meaning of degrees and qualifications? Again, maybe literacy is not the only variable. In fact, you know, many colleges, when we confront them with it, say, yeah, you know, I'm not teaching people to read. You know, I'm talking about other things. But then again, you know, if literacy is a covariate for success in adult life, how do those things square? But again, we should be looking at those kinds of data. They show us that, you know, skills, qualifications can be very, very different stories. Immigration, you know, it's been often presented, you know, as what keeps us back, what holds systems down. And on the surface, there is, you know, reason to believe that. You can see that, you know, the literacy skills of people with immigrant backgrounds, first generation immigrant backgrounds, are quite far behind of those without an immigration background. In not every country, but in a lot of countries. To some extent, that is a socioeconomic story, and once you discount for that, the length of the bar gets lower in most countries, but, you know, there's a lot of that remains. But that's not so much a surprise. You know, if you were foreign born, you come into the country, you don't have as much of the language skills and so on, and, you know, this assessment is done in the language of the host country. It doesn't look at literacy, it looks at literacy in the language that is spoken in the countries where you go to, and can be a very, very big factor. And so this is not so surprising. The more interesting analysis is this one. When you actually look at second-generation immigrants, those who have been born in the country of destination, you can see the gap gets very, very small in most countries. In fact, there is a number of countries, if you look to, you know, Ireland, if you look to Canada, if you look to Israel, where it goes in the opposite direction. Actually, you are most likely to do better than the people who were born in the country and had parents born in that country. So actually, and you'll see that later on when we put all of that together, that immigration is not a big factor in explaining changes that we have observed. Neither is changes in the socioeconomic composition. So when we actually look at all of that together, for example, we can see that, you know, cohorts can explain part of the story. And it's very interesting when you look at, you know, England. Most of the improvements that we could see in literacy and numeracy have been driven by younger people. So there's reason to believe that, you know, there have been improvements on the education front. Younger people have moved upwards. Older people, we can't say that. You can look at Sweden, where you suddenly see it's the pink square, not the blue triangle that is improved. It's the older people. And it's one of the very few countries, and that's very precious on PIAAC, that shows us you can actually learn when you're older. The kind of lifelong, life-wide learning, you know, you can see working and learning is quite well integrated. The kind of signals are much more fine-grained, micro-credentials exist. I mean, all of the things play out, they do make a difference. People have different learning behaviors, and you can see that in the results. You see some countries, New Zealand is an interesting example where it is the young people, the lower skills of young people that have dragged, the population down. So yeah, cohorts have played some role in helping us understand the changes, both in literacy and numeracy. No? The qualification part is, harder to unpack. You can see that, rising education attainment has, improved literacy. Education attainment is a predictor of literacy, so you have more people getting better qualifications. That has, been a positive factor, but I already highlighted it several times. We have seen a decline within the education levels. So every education level has, and that has largely offset that. Now, when you actually add those lines up, you end up in most countries with 0. So you cannot say that, rising qualification levels have really made a difference in the skill distribution of people. No? And the last factor, I highlighted already, you can put immigration into the mix, and you can see, in a few countries, you could argue, in Germany or Austria, yeah, maybe a little, but look at the scale. We're talking about, 4 or 5 points on the PIAAC scale. Most of the other things we talked about 20, 30 points, 15 points. So in absolute terms, things that are statistically significant are not often meaningful. No, that's often, it goes both ways sometimes, but I think in this case, I think one can say the difference, the impact that immigration makes is really, really small. Now, the best answer to this, paradox is, of course, the outcomes that we see in skills. And that's actually, I think, one of the biggest strengths of the survey of adult skills, and perhaps the one that, I would like to see improved in the future. Our ability to measure outcomes that matter for people in our economies. At the moment, we look at very simple things. We look at, labor force participation, and you can see, yeah, by numeracy, that is a difference. That people with higher numeracy skills are more likely to be in the labor market, not so much, so surprisingly, than people with baseline qualifications or, very low levels of skill levels. Now and that's not so much a surprise. If you want to get a job, you have to get, a certain level of skills. And but what's also interesting is if you actually look at what drives wages. You see here the numeracy skills and the years of education. So one is formal education attainment, what qualification you got, how long you stayed, and the other is numeracy skills. And you can see there are countries where you can say, skills matter a lot. They explain a lot of your wages. But there are many more countries where it is still, credentials. So employers looking for formal degrees. Or, qualifications are simply about a lot more than literacy skills. And I think we need to sort of understand those kinds of relationships. Is it, that employers are not very good in finding out what your skills are? That could be one explanation. They look at your degree, your credential, because that's the only thing they can see. Or is it because, education attainment is not just about skills, but also about, your persistence, your capacity to sort of work on complex things and so on. And I think that's something, not so obvious from this data, but I think a really good question for research. Interestingly is that, the education factor is far more predictive for women than for men. So men seem to have an easier, task with, showing their skills and getting paid for that, whereas for women in most countries, actually having the formal qualification and level of education attainment seems more important. But again, you see lots of variation on that also across countries. So, but I think also something for us worth to look at. And then, skills, yeah, I already made that point. Last point really is about, mismatches. Do the qualifications that you have, the skills that you have, really, match what is required at your workplace? And I don't think our data on this are so strong, because the only way we can assess this is by asking people that question themselves. You have better qualifications than what is needed for your job. That's not, very, very strong evidence, but it's the best thing that we can get. And when you do that, you can see that a lot of people believe that they are overqualified for what they currently do. No, I have better qualifications than I would have needed in my job. And a few people think that they are underqualified, that they miss things that they would really need. But you add those numbers up and you can see actually mismatch. It's pretty big in most areas. A good share of our workforce believe that they're either overqualified or underqualified. Another angle to do that is to ask companies. And for a few countries, we were able to get those data. I find them really, really interesting because that's sort of a more direct picture of the demand side. And the picture is, perhaps a bit more positive when you ask actually companies about skill gaps, apart from the Slovak Republic. It's about, 20% of people who say, yeah, there is a big problem. And then, many of them actually don't know. The black bar was a surprise to me, that companies have often, not much of an idea about skill gaps. But mostly the picture that you get from the supply side is more promising than what you could see from the picture forecast. No? And very last point is, it does matter. You can see that, there is an effect. If you are overqualified for your current job, your employer will not pay you for skills that they do not see. So it's not that this is without any consequence. I'm overqualified and so not. No, actually, it does make a difference. There is a kind of wage penalty that you pay for this, and this highlights why it is important for us to do a better job to align skills and qualifications with the requirements. No? That's really all I wanted to share with you. I do think, this relationship between skills and qualification is something that we need to better and better understand also, because I believe in the future it will become more and more important. In the past, the qualification that you got at the beginning of your life, you carry on for many years. It's going to be valid for a long time. I don't think that's holding today, and that will hold less in the future. Requirements will change. Our capacity to continue to learn will become more important. In the past, we used to learn to do our work, and now learning is the work. That's the big paradigm shift, and that's why studies like PIAAC will become incredibly more important in the future than they are now. That's all I wanted to share. I look forward to our discussion.